The issue of anti-Semitism here in Australia, which we know is on the rise. A few days ago, we saw the PM speaking at the opening of a Holocaust museum in Melbourne, where he vowed that anti-Semitism had no place in Australia. Let's take a listen to some of what he said.
As the conflict continues, anti-Semitism is on the rise, but we will not let it find as much as a foothold here. Australia will always denounce it and reject it utterly, just as we do all forms of racism and prejudice.
But as Paul Kelly pointed out quite rightly, I think, in his column in the Oz this weekend, it's too late. The foothold is already established. We've already seen anti-Jewish rhetoric in the media and on the streets. I mean, October the 8th, people yelling, "Gas the Jews," on the steps of the Sydney Opera House. School kids skipping class this week to attend pro-Palestinian rallies. I mean, Caroline, I don't think the Prime Minister can sit there with a straight face and say, oh, well, we're going to stop it in its tracks. Mate, the tracks are already 100 miles up the road.
It doesn't have a foothold. It's already at the top of the ladder. It's way too late. And part of the problem has been how the government has tried to talk out of both sides of its mouth on this issue.
Well,
Albanese has to take
who you listen to
some
at any given moment.
Well, exactly. Their own cabinet is divided when you have ministers like Ed Husic saying that Israel is engaging in collective punishment of Palestinians.
Which is a war crime.
Exactly, and there is no basis for that kind of statement. It belongs firmly with completely ignorant protesters who are professional protesters on the street and other people who have irrational biases against the Jewish people and the Jewish state. But he doesn't help, because when he speaks about this issue, he invariably has to mention Islamophobia at the same time, when that is not the issue we're talking about here. Of course, people are against all kinds of racism, but the problem at the moment is anti-Semitism, and the government itself, and the Prime Minister especially, does not have moral clarity on that issue. Well,
look at the way the US responded, Sharri, where shortly after October 7, they started up the first ever, fight against Islamophobia, an official thing out of the White House. Like, could you read the room?
I know, it's exactly the same thing. And I think to some people, they think, oh, well, and probably the Prime Minister himself doesn't understand what he's done wrong, because he technically hasn't said anything wrong. But his handling of this, his management, couldn't have been worse, and it is so deeply offensive and distressing. We have an unprecedented in Australia, anti-Semitism crisis. This is, the antithesis of what Australia stands for, of what our values are, and our political leadership has allowed it to fester and explode on our very streets. And Caroline is right. Albanese has allowed this because he continues to lecture Israel. Penny Wong continues to lecture Israel about its military tactics. They're allowing the incorrect perception out there that Israel has committed war crimes. It hasn't. Israel has gone above and beyond what any other country engaging in war does, staying on the phone to people until they evacuate their apartments, sending 6 million text messages to people begging them to leave, delaying a ground incursion because people weren't leaving northern Gaza. Israel is doing everything it can to protect civilian lives, and yet our media keep reporting these figures from Hamas. Well, I'm sorry, but they're wrong. We already know with that bombing at the hospital that wasn't Israel in the end, but after 5 minutes, the figures came out claiming 500 people were killed. In the end, it was 50. In the end, Israel hadn't bombed the hospital. The bombing was in the car park, not in the hospital. But why that's important is because it shows you a very clear example of how quickly they come up with the death toll. And besides, not only are these figures from Hamas, but they do not distinguish between the loss of life between civilians and terrorists.
And the loss of life that Hamas itself causes.
Exactly.
But I just want to, before I let someone else have a go, because there's enough criticism of Jews taking over the media without Sharri and I completely dominating this episode. I just want to say, I think you're being too generous to Albanese here. I think he knows exactly what he's doing. He knows what he's doing. He's appealing to his base in Western Sydney, the seats that Labor have there. A lot of Muslim people who who sympathise, obviously, with the pro-Palestinian cause. There's a lot of people in his own seat in the inner west who would sympathise with the Greens and the far left protesters. And he's thinking about those seats. It's a political decision.
I understand. I think that is a bit rough. I don't think that is. I think Albanese comes from a background of the left. I don't think he's been particularly, I don't think he's given a huge amount of thought to this issue, quite frankly.
He spent so many years railing against
But he is being criticised from his own side. All those people you mentioned, they have criticised him for being too pro-Israel. They do not think he is towing their line.
He's the Prime Minister of Australia. This crisis is happening on his watch, on our streets,
absolutely. That's right. And I don't.
And I think up, and he has never done a press conference in the Blue Room and stood there and said, "This has to stop. Stop protesting because it's anti-Semitic. You're calling for the destruction of the Jewish homeland. It's unacceptable."
And that goes back to the point you made before about the way the propaganda from Hamas was allowed to proliferate through the media after that strike near a hospital which came out of Palestine itself. In that regard, Hamas has been able to win the information war because it doesn't care. It can make anything it wants up and it publishes it immediately.
Because it's got useful idiots like Greta Thunberg and Gigi Haddad and Bella Haddad, spreading lies.
And the effect of that and the effect of all these protests we keep seeing, because they continue unabated, is that even though the people who rock up to those protests, Paul, may, in the grand scheme of things of the total Australian population, be a minority, they rock up in great number and they rock up in force. And so it gives the impression that they stand with the majority. And that's why the information war, the showing, matters so much.
All right, let's all play a game together. Now, I was thinking about how to frame this, and there's no right way to frame this, and I'm going to get into trouble whatever I say here. So let's all enjoy my final appearance on TV. If you had taken, what would Australia's response be to, let's even say, 50 protesters who walked up the main drag of any place in the country, and pick any race you want, and they held up signs saying, "Kill the," or "the place would be better off without the," or "get rid of the." Our response as a society would be utter revulsion. The response of the political class would be to immediately seek to sanction. If any of them had jobs, the people would be cancelled. If the kids were prefects at school, they'd be suspended. If there's any further insight about the, not nudge, wink, wink encouragement, but the lack of response, is replace the word Jew with anything else.
Of course.
And what would the response... And that's where I've said before...
I don't know why you would have thought that was a controversial point to make.
This is because...
Agree.
Of course, but my point is that I was going to start offering examples, and then I realised that might be my final appearance on television.
Right. I'll do that final appearance.
But you get my point. And this is where I've been railing against Claire O'Neill as the Home Affairs Minister, right? She's the boss of the ministerial with responsibility of the AFP, ASIO and Border Force, right? Yeah. She should have come out the day after those hate preachers first started to appear saying, sorry, not on, I've called a meeting of all the people, how are these people being policed? Instead, it's not happening. Instead, change the subject over here, change the subject over there. So I think we can all see what the intensity of the government is, and the intensity of the government is to try to ride this out. And when you're talking about people on the streets of Australia saying that certain populations should die, you're not going to be able to ride that out.
I can tell you exactly what the problem is. The problem is there has been such a long-standing anti-Israel position from the hard left and also from the left of the Labor Party, and I'm certainly not denying that. If you look at, for example, the response from even Albo, who I think has been not as bad as a lot of people are saying, but Chris Minns, who has been really, really strong, the dyed-in-the-wool Labor right Premier of New South Wales. It's been a real study in contrast. And again, I say this as someone who thinks that Albo thinks that he is saying the right thing, that he thinks that he is saying the right thing. The problem is, and it's almost more insidious than I suppose all of us are sort of thumping the desk and talking about it, is that for so long there's been a fig leaf of anti-Zionism, if you like, that has covered the anti-Semitism that is ultimately, whether they know it or not, at the very heart of the left's position. Because, again, they couldn't possibly allow themselves to think these things about any other ethnicity, any other race. And if you want to have the most perfect example of all, let's just think about that Jewish school that tried to book at Jumping Castle and got told, no, go and get effed, you Zionist murderers or whatever. And just imagine if an Islamic school had tried to book a Jumping Castle and the business had said, no way am I giving that to you, you bunch of terrorists.
The white bloke from Country Club.
And those are two exactly analogous things. And so the people say that, you know, oh no, it's not Jews we have a problem with, it's Israel or it's Zionists, as if anyone who's Jewish is going to be opposed to Jerusalem or Israel. So you're not going to have
there are a few
self-hating, but again, that's semantics as it stands. But again, just imagine though if the same argument applied. Oh no, we're not anti-Muslim, we're just anti-terrorist, but we also think that all Muslims are terrorists.